Thank you, Lee.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. As I see more names joining in the waiting room, I'm going to go ahead and promote you from attendees to panelists so that you can turn on your cameras and then raise your virtual hands when it comes time for Q&A. If I don't promote you or if I miss your name somehow, but you'd like to join with your camera or mics on, raise your virtual hand and I'll make sure to go back and put you in the panelists with the rest of us. Thank you so much.
So welcome, everybody. Please open your cameras and we can kind of create a bit of a community feel to our conversation.
Okay, I see more people joining. So once again, I'll be promoting everyone from attendees to panelists. So if you get my invite, please accept it so that you can turn on your cameras and mics and participate in the Q&A portion of the lecture. If I miss your name somehow, just raise your virtual hand and I'll make sure and promote you to panelists.
Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We'll wait a minute or two for people to turn on your cameras. And I guess while you're turning on your camera, I will introduce Lee Jussim. Lee is a social psychologist and a distinguished professor at Rutgers University in New Jersey, and he's a professor in the Department of Psychology. He served as the chair on 2 occasions, and he's the founding member of the Heterodox Academy, the Academy for Freedom Alliance, and the Society for Open Inquiry into Behavioral Science. He has his own lab with 15 to 20 scholars, and he's well published on an array of issues. Lee is also connected to NCRI, which is working with ISGAP on a project together. And he's working closely with Joel Finkelstein, who's also connected to NCRI and also associated with ISGAP. Joel, unfortunately, cannot be here today. And I guess because of several matters, Lee and I think Bill will help as well. We're going to try and have a more informal conversation about issues of anti-Semitism. And the purpose of this seminar series, as you know, is trying to create a conceptual interdisciplinary framework to critically analyze anti-Semitism, contemporary anti-Semitism, and socioeconomic, political, cultural processes associated with contemporary anti-Semitism. And our argument as a group of scholars is that unlike issues of race and gendered identities, which has a strong pedigree in academia and universities for many decades, there's sort of a framework to analyze issues of racism, sexism, homophobia. But when it comes to anti-Semitism in the academy, there really is not a framework to really contextualize anti-Semitism historically and also in the contemporary context. So why is anti-Semitism increasing? What are the dynamics in society that are creating social movements, reactionary social movements of the extreme left, the extreme right, and extreme or political Islam? Why in 2023 is this becoming a phenomenon? And our argument at ISGAP among the research fellows is that basically there's excellent work on anti-Semitism, but it's descriptive in nature. It describes what's happening. And in a sense, what we're trying to do is understand why this is happening, not what is happening, but why is it happening. I think once we begin to understand why it's happening, its manifestations in society, in language, in culture, in education, in power dynamics, once we can conceptually create this framework, it will help us to analyze, to map, decode, and then develop strategies, effective strategies to fight anti-Semitism. So Lee is joining more in the conversation, and I think it's a timely conversation. It's sort of a pause, perhaps in a way, in a formal paper. I know that some of you over the weeks have been finding some of the seminars a bit esoteric, maybe too academic, but in a way, this is really a seminar series which is coming out of the Wolf Institute at Cambridge University, where ISGAP has a fellowship training program, and it's designed really to be a scholarly endeavor. So what I would like to do is, Lee, kind of put you on the spot for a moment, if I may. And if, from your perspective, could you please describe, some of the work you do, the work that you're focusing on? You can touch upon our project a bit if you'd like, at some level. But from your perspective, how do you understand the importance of the seminar series of trying, really to establish a conceptual framework, an interdisciplinary conceptual framework to deal with issues of contemporary anti-Semitism?
Maybe, Lee, I'm just going to maybe amplify Charles's point a little bit. And I think it's very important to have your perspective today, because many of the contributors that have been part of the seminar series are coming from traditional humanist or social science backgrounds. And what you're really doing is bringing a different set of tools to us. Yep. So I think to me, it's fascinating as a humanist, and I've worked with you and Joel a little bit, to think about the ways in which the humanities and social science and big data have come together in this project that you've been working on. So to address Charles's question, the general thing, but also I'd be very interested in the particularity of just your approach and how you approach such an issue having to deal with anti-Semitism or any other kinds of issues that you at NCRI are tracking.
Okay, well, so first, this is my first attendance at an ISGAP type event. So I'm not familiar, to start with this qualification. I don't know, the prior things you've done, how you're thinking about it, but so in some sense, I'm asking advance forgiveness if I say a few things that are completely obvious to all of you. It's well-worn ground that you've been discussing for 5 years already, because I'm not familiar with what you've been discussing for the last few years, for the most part. But yes, I've come around. So I'm trained as a social psychologist. Social psychologists typically do experiments and surveys. That's what we do. We do lab experiments. We get, periodically disdained for, appropriately, I think, for running experiments on intro psych undergrads, and what does this have to do with the rest of the real world and all that kind of stuff. Well, sometimes we've gotten better at running them on, more broader, more representative samples of people from the real world. But that's my background and training. Anti-Semitism, as far as I can tell, is like the classic thing that needs to be approached from exactly the kind of interdisciplinary perspective that you're all talking, because it has deep historical roots and manifestations. It has political manifestations. It has a psychological component. And it's like, you can't, if you really want to understand anti-Semitism, it helps to bring all of that to bear. And it really helps. Like the history, I'll give you a very concrete example. Isabella, who's here, has written articulately about the way in which Soviet propaganda has promoted a sort of virulent form of anti-Zionism that kind of overflows into anti-Semitism. She's also written about, I first came across Isabella not via her anti-Semitism stuff. It was her article, The American Soviet Mentality, which was about the sort of rise of intolerance and sort of, you could call it cancel culture or whatever you want, especially, not exclusively, but especially on the American left. And so Isabella is doing that from a historical perspective, but to some extent a political perspective as well, but wasn't bringing in experiments or surveys or anything like that. But one of the things, well, these results have begun to come in. So with cooperation from, or collaboration with both NCRI and FIRE, do you guys know who FIRE is? So let me look, okay, so Isabella's shaking her head. Yes, nobody, everything else looks like blank looks. So FIRE stands for the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Until about 6 months or a year ago, they were the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education. With the decline or corruption of the ACLU, they have kind of stepped into the breach and expanded their mission from purely protecting academic freedom to really defending free speech and individual rights and liberties more generally. So with collaboration from some of their researchers, we have identified, and actually Isabella provided some of the propaganda. We've run a survey experiment drawing on Isabella's expertise. She produced for us propaganda image, Soviet era propaganda images. And you typically, the most useful ones, the most relevant ones were the anti-racist, anti-American propaganda. So for example, my favorite one of those was like a cartoon, a political cartoon showing the Statue of Liberty at a distance, all inspiring and Statue of Liberty-ish, and then a close-up on her head where the spires are Ku Klux Klansmen. Okay, that's what I mean by this sort of virulent anti-American stuff. Okay, so we gave some of those images and then neutral images to people. We conducted a national survey, and we examined how. So let me back up a little bit. In social and political science, people have spent much of the last 50 years coming up with attempts to measure sort of psychological authoritarianism. Now, this started in the wake of World War II, like how could the Nazis have happened? And the first attempt was this very famous team led by Adorno, produced a book called The Authoritarian Personality. Adorno, I think, was a Marxist, and they were trying to understand the Nazis. So really what this turned out to be was an attempt to study right-wing authoritarianism. And that then set the tone for the next 50 years, where for the most part, within social and political science, the study of authoritarianism, at least in the States, and to some extent Europe, the social and political science study of authoritarianism was mostly the study of right-wing authoritarianism. Okay, about 4 or 5 years ago, 2 independent teams, well, the lore became that there was no left-wing authoritarianism in the democratic West, that the lore within the social sciences. Now, how that happened is I could give a whole talk on that. But about 4 or 5 years ago, 2 independent teams said, no, actually, it's really not that hard to measure left-wing authoritarianism. And they conducted multiple studies, validated this new questionnaire. So we used one of those questionnaires. And what we are finding is that left-wing authoritarianism predicts endorsement and liking and credibility of these sort of virulent anti-racist Soviet era propaganda cartoons. And it predicts it over and above ideology. Okay, so yeah, so we'll run a survey. We'll ask, do you place yourself on the scale, which will go from liberal to conservative, to you see yourself as a Democrat or Republican, go from strong Democrat to center to strong Republican. Combine all that. That's simple ideology or political identity that's to be distinguished from left-wing authoritarianism, which has three main components based on the survey. There's authoritarian aggression, endorsement of punishing one's political opponents. There is censorship, a desire to shut down the speech of one's opponents, and then there's this desire to sort of overturn the existing status and power hierarchies. Okay, so that sort of captures what the scale captures, but the scale predicts endorsement of these sort of virulent anti-American images. Okay, so why am I telling you about this? What does it have to do with anti-Semitism? Well, I think it actually has to do quite a lot with anti-Semitism, even though that study was not on anti-Semitism, because historically, and this is why you need the humanities and it's a sort of multidisciplinary approach. Historically, the connection between various forms of authoritarianism and anti-Semitism has been very strong. And so, an individual, so again, I'm a psychologist, certainly a particular person might hold prejudice towards or antipathy towards Jews. So that's the psychological component. But Jews have mostly done well historically in open society which protect individual rights. You just look all through history, even in some of the places that turned terrible. Before they turned terrible, Jews did well. So there appears to be this sort of strong historical nexus between authoritarianism and anti-Semitism. And you can document some of that historically, but one of the things we're working on now is trying to capture that empirically. So, does it manifest? Are people who endorse authoritarian values, well, this is well established on the right. So there's a long history of research showing that right-wing authoritarianism strongly predicts all sorts of prejudice. It's not restricted to anti-Semitism, certainly includes anti-Semitism. But because the empirical study of individual the psychological authoritarianism on the left is relatively new. There has been very little, there's been a lot of discourse, even in academia, about progressive anti-Semitism, but there really hasn't been a lot of empirical research. And it is pretty clear from current events and rhetoric and the kind of social media analysis that the NCRI will do, looking at memes and code words and hashtags on Twitter or Reddit or Facebook, that this sort of virulent anti-Zionism readily overflows into anti-Semitism. I suspect that is connected to left-wing authoritarianism, and we are actually working on just such a project. So I think I'm going to stop there. That's sort of an intro to sort of why I think you're right. This is a heavily interdisciplinary project.
So Lee, it's fascinating what you and NCR are doing, but I want to push you a bit. So I come from a background that uses both empiricism and conceptual analysis. And usually there's a division in academia. Some are empiricists, other people deal with conceptual issues. And I was sort of trained at the importance of doing both, to analyze a social formation, a society based on strong empirical analysis, but also to put it in a framework in which, I guess, power and other issues are used as a tool to analyze the empirical analysis. So you do amazing, rich, detailed empirical analysis on authoritarianism, the rise of anti-Semitism. You show the correlation between authoritarianism and anti-Semitism. But in your professional expert opinion, why would you think that anti-Semitism is increasing today? So you describe it, I know, extraordinarily well in great detail and in a dynamic way, actually. Why is it happening today? From your kind of professional expertise, why now?
Okay, well, so definitely from just paying attention to the world now, and now I'm talking in the realm of opinion, which is what you asked me about. You have, on the right, you have a dramatic rise in sort of proto-authoritarian populism, which has, whether it's Netanyahu or Trump or Orban. You have right-wing leaders sort of lethally valorizing the most crude language in dealing with their political opponents. And that has, so on the right, you have this sort of liberation for people to say what they think, coming from the leadership who is modeling exactly how to do that. So you have that on the right. On the left, what you have is the widespread, and I'm talking about so there's in the US, I'm most familiar with US data, so I'm going to stick to that. In the US, no matter how different surveys ask slightly different questions and will get slightly different results. But when people are divided into the far left and far right, as center left, center right, center, but I'm talking specifically about the extreme ends, they typically come in single digits. 5%, 7%, 8%, occasionally 10%. And so in some ways, it's not a lot of people, but in some ways it is, or at least in some contexts. So one of my former students, who now is working as a research scientist at FIRE, for his dissertation, he conducted a national survey of almost 2,000 faculty in the United States, and found that 40% self-described as radicals, activists, Marxists, or socialists. So the number might be 7 or 8% in the population. It is almost half of the American Academy. And the number was almost 60% among graduate students who are future faculty. So, in some ways, the lore on the right, especially among, sort of right-wing type, right-wing talking points, is that academia is overrun with leftists. That is data, on the basis of the data, that is beginning to look like it's becoming true. So it wasn't true 10 or 20 years ago, but it looks like it's actually becoming true. Like, just like that's the, overrun is a pejorative way to put it. But, if at some point it becomes 50, it's on a trajectory to be 50, 60, 70%. Like, I don't know, is overrun pejorative? Like, okay, majority, is that better? I don't know. So the intellectual atmosphere within academia is very different than it is in the rest of the country, and it's very different than it was in academia 30 years ago. Okay, so how is that relevant? Well, because on the far left, and you all, I think everybody here knows this, you have the rise of sort of anti-imperialist, anti-colonial rhetoric. You have Israel routinely now being described as an apartheid settler colonial state. These are progressive talking points that may particularly target Israel, but they're way not exclusively targeting it. They target all sorts of places. And so Jews have been caught up in the rise of this sort of intellectual rhetoric on the left that probably both is earnest in some sense, in the sense that it is not uniquely applied to Israel, but probably is, probably, my guess is, and we're trying to, capture this empirically, but probably given some extra oomph or power or energy by some level of anti-Semitism among people who are sort of virulently anti-Zionist. So I think I'm going to stop there. So that you have, so we Jews are now being caught in this sort of, unplanned. It's not like, the right-wing extremists and left-wing extremists are sitting in dark basements, twirling their mustaches, saying, how can we get the Jews? Nobody's doing that. but it is in effect a pincer movement coming from both the left and the right that is putting pressure on Jews. That's my opinion.
Right. So, Leah, so there's a few
I mean,
questions.
is it? Yeah.
Yeah, we'll bring it in. So, yeah, so I think what you just said now is insightful, and I agree with you 100%. But I think, in a way, as scholars, again, I'll come back to the question: why now? What in our civilization, Western society, why do these social movements kind of get connected to issues of anti-Semitism and their ideology? Why is there fragmentation in our societies today? Why is there the rise of, as you say, kind of authoritarian right-wing leaders? Why is the left becoming more extreme? And what is the role of anti-Semitism in this? So why the fragmentation, and why the emergence of these social movements? I think that's the issues that, I don't know, animate me, in a way, and to define this from an interdisciplinary perspective. But I'll bring in Isabella for a question, comment. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lee. Really good to see you. I just want to, reinforce what you say. I mean, it's really striking, your numbers about the percentage of faculty and students who identify, graduate students who identify as Marxist. I've been looking over the last few months very, very closely, really, at the writings that were influenced by the Soviet thinking that were produced in English. Through English language periodicals, various theoretical journals, Marxist theoretical journals, and more popular press. And, it's truly, truly striking that already in the 60s and 70s, and certainly in the 80s, but already in the 60s, the left, through this Soviet kind of propaganda machine, created this fusion between American imperialism and Israel, between Israel and South Africa, between Israel and apartheid, and Israel and racism. And it's truly just, it's repetition of these particular talking points over and over and over again in every language on the planet, literally. So there was this Marxist theoretical journal that was published in Prague, that was published in 26 languages and was distributed in over 40 countries. When you look at that, when you look at these articles that were published there, you really start to understand it. So I think I can't answer the complex questions about why now, or I can put out hypotheses that won't necessarily be, anyway, I think we all have our ideas about why it's coming forward now. But I think the really important thing to understand is these ideas, this fusion of Israel and Zionism with American imperialism and colonialism, and really like the worst that there is on the planet, already became part of that's my view, became part of the left's DNA already 50 years ago. And today it's finding expression in the mainstream. I mean, why we can talk about that, but it always was there on the far left. So that's just my comment.
Thank you, Isabella. Lee, do you want to respond? Any thoughts?
Yeah, so, I'm not going to pretend to really have an answer to Charles's question of why now, but like an answer was probably, it's almost surely massively multiply determined. But I actually think Isabella's point, combined with some of the data I just presented, actually can help begin to answer it. So, the idea that there are political extremists always exist and have always existed and will always exist. You come back to America 50 years from now or 100 years from now, there's going to be political extremists. In any society, there are political extremists. But one piece of sort of why now, I think, is this. I think I could draw a nearly straight line from Isabella's historical analysis of the sort of anti-Zionist rhetoric that was common on the left in the 60s and 70s. And so here, this is, I'll propose this as perhaps a vastly oversimplified hypothesis, and I will jettison it when it is falsified. But that you have the rhetoric is approximately the same. I mean, it manifests in different ways, but you have this sort of anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, settler colonial, apartheid, Zionism is racism thing. This has been going on for a very long time. But it hadn't mostly infected much of academia, because in the 1970s, academia wasn't almost half radicals, activists, Marxists, and socialists. Now that academia is 40% and growing radicals, activists, these are people who endorse and are sort of vulnerable to believing, people they know and like think these things, just on the simple left-right in the social sciences and humanities, which are the fields most likely to deal with political and politicized topics. The proportion of faculty on the left-right, especially at the elite institutions, ranges from like 10 to 10 faculty on the left to every one on the right, to like infinity, because there is no one on the right. Those ratios range to infinity because there's no one on the right. So in that kind of atmosphere, this rhetoric and these ideas become at least reasonable and possibly normative. Now, okay, well, so what? Well, academia has been, along with mass media, one of the main knowledge production institutions of the society. So if one of the main knowledge production institutions of the society is geared around, demonizing and delegitimizing Zionism in Israel, that is a change compared to 1968. So I do think that is in the mix. That may not be I'm sure that is not the full answer to your question, Charles, but I am pretty sure that's in the mix.
That's interesting. Okay, thank you, Lee. Thank you. I have many questions, but I'll give other people the floor. Professor Asher, I see your hand is up.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Anybody with the name Asher in any part of the name, I admire a lot. And thank you very much. I'm impressed that anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and nobody mentioned yet anti-Americanism. Those three go together, and it is a reflection of the fact that Jews in general are perceived to be omnipotent, omnipresent, and omniscient. Perhaps the issue of the protocols of the elders of Zion have taken hold again. And it seems that it is easier to be anti-Semitic when you perceive Jews to be that powerful. And the role of Israel in this, of course, is essential. 100 years ago, the Jews were not so prevalent in power. So it was easy to subterraneanly to attack them. Today, it is accepted that you can confront them because they seem to be so obviously around. And I think authoritarianism again is something that hides its deep pathologies, and one way to camouflage that, as I written to you, was to blame the Jews. It's easier to do it to deflect criticism. On the other hand, you can't do that for very long in a free and open and democratic society, because you have to come to grips with yourself, with what kind of nation are you building? And you cannot build a nation on the opposition to Jews. What do you think about all of that?
Yeah, okay. So I have two responses to that. One, I think it's absolutely right, but I am going to object that nobody has to the idea that nobody here has talked about the connection between this and anti-Americanism. I opened with that. That was you're right. You have the sort of left-wing authoritarianism leading to endorsement of anti-American Soviet propaganda. So we haven't published that yet, but that's hot off the press. We are absolutely studying that, and we have some data on that. But in addition, I think I'm going to share can I share my screen? Do I have that authority or ability?
Yes, you should be able to.
One of the ways this manifests now, do you guys, let's see, sure. Can you see this?
Yeah.
Yes.
One of the ways that anti-Americanism has, there's this, I mean, in my opinion, it is a pseudo, I mean, it's definitely a powerful intellectual current, but in the progressive social science and humanities academia, you have widespread denunciations of whiteness. You know, whiteness is sort of the harbinger of all things evil. And this is actually an award-winning paper. So, and you can see what the part that I've highlighted there. Parasitic whiteness renders its hosts' appetites voracious, insatiable, and perverse. These deformed appetites particularly target non-white peoples. Once established, these appetites are nearly impossible to eliminate. This kind of rhetoric is now reasonably common in the academic social sciences and humanities left. And when I first came across this, actually, I thought it was a hoax. So without going into all the detail, 5 or 6 years ago, Helen Pluckrose, James Lindsay, and Peter Boghossian, sort of a philosopher of humanities and sort of independent scholar, wrote up a bunch of papers that made ridiculous claims, sort of like these. And they managed to get them published in peer-reviewed journals to expose the political corruption of those journals. So the things that got published included things like white students in college classrooms should be chained to the floor in order to experience oppression. Another argued that, at least metaphorically, men should be leashed like dogs in order to control their baser instincts. Then I got this stuff published, and this make my head explode. So I thought,
what is parasitic whiteness? Can you explain that for us?
It's it is what this guy describes here. It's right. It's the idea. Well, okay. Here, I think I'm going to do this metaphorically. When I came across this, first I thought it was a hoax, and then it struck me as familiar. And I'm like, months went by, like I had other things to do. It's not like I'm sitting here agitating on this ridiculous paper. And then it hit me. So that this was classic Nazi era rhetoric. So why not just go to the source? So I went to Mein Kampf and what the hell happened? Let me get out of here. Oh, there we go. Let me go back to the share. And if I can go here, will that work? There we go. So there is the quote from Mein Kampf that strikes me as disturbingly parallel to this sort of denunciation of whiteness published in 2021 or 22, right? And you can read that for yourselves. I mean, the parallels between the rhetoric are just jaw-dropping, actually. And so, I think Escher was right. You have this. I mean, in some sense, and Pamela Paresky has a great piece. I think it's in Sapir Journal, titled "The Hyper-White Jew." So, in the nightmares or delusions of the far left, success is nothing but privilege and exploitation. There's no such thing as success. It's all unearned advantages and taking advantage of the oppressed. And so but if you start with that as your premise, there's no such thing as accomplishment, merit, achievement, competence. That's all unearned privilege. And Jews are unbelievably successful in the democratic West, which compared to most other demographic and ethnic groups, they are, well, then of course, Jews are the ultimate evil.
So I want to leave, it's fascinating, but I want to push back. I think there's a tendency in the United States to dismiss critical race theory, to dismiss issues of race, racism, whiteness, blackness. I think what you said about Jews, Jews were, as we all know, hunted and exterminated for not being white and poisoning the purity of the white Aryan race. And a generation and a half later, as you said, we're the quintessential white apartheid supporting races. And this is in academia. So the shift is astounding. And it's not the Jews are white, sorry for what happened and welcome to the club. No, now we've become the quintessential enemy again. But I want to also push back. I think that there is a legacy, and I think aspects of the study of race and racism in the last 50 or 60 years in academia, I think could be helpful and important to the work that we're doing on issues of anti-Semitism, because whiteness, the social construction of whiteness and blackness, goes deep into Western thought, philosophy, the sciences, eugenics, etc. There's a whole body of material was created on these constructed ideas, in a sense. And I think, as David Patterson points out, before the Europeans went to colonize the world in this sort of framework of science and social sciences and theology and military policy to conquer those who were deemed less worthy as human beings, from white to black, there was a scale. Hegel, Descartes, all the leading philosophers and theologians bought into this idea. And it was actually the European responsibility to colonize darker people and in some cases enslave them as a way to lift them up and to make them become better human beings, to civilize them, right? And I think, anti-Semitism, in a way, racist anti-Semitism, was at the forefront, was at the foundation of racism, in a way. So
may I just intrude one more thought that is so obvious, speaking empirically. There is no nation has progressed, if we go through history, that has persecuted and attacked Jews. Every nation that has embraced and welcomed Jews has progressed, has been exceptional. So even England, when they expelled the Jews, had to come around and invite them back. Spain now extends citizenship to their former subjects. Portugal, it's amazing. Russia would never be a progressive society because it has persisted in its attack on Jews. Germany has come around. Can you imagine today that we should say that Germany is one of the three centers of Jewish population after Israel and the United States? But that is true. This is amazing. So, I mean, there is hope, but at the same time, we have to understand how anti-Semitism has retarded progress.
Thank you, Usher. Bill, thank you. Bill, Bill and then Charles.
I'm listening. I'm listening attentively.
All right, cool. Charlie.
I would make one point. I think your question about timing is correlated to one variable. And that timing is capitalism has had a very bad record of what I would call income allocation or income inequality. That income inequality narrative has grown very rapidly. And the Jews become part of that conversation.
Yeah.
And much has been written about the income inequality issues from various economists of how to rectify it. But part of it embraces a racist ideology. And that income inequality, Thomas Piketty writes about it in his works as an economist. I see it in many corporations because I manage money. I run a hedge fund. But I think the income inequality issue is at a level where it exacerbates the racist anti-Semitic narrative.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that's a very important area that we have to examine to really understand why there's a reemergence of anti-Semitism and the fragmentation of society. I think that's of paramount importance.
Yeah, that is, I think that's a great point. I just want to reemphasize that. I think that's a great point. That is something I had not previously considered, was not in my thinking per se, except maybe at the deep periphery about sort of progressive anti-Semitism. You now have me thinking about how to translate that into psychological measures that could be captured in an empirical study, right? So are people who are more concerned about or more aware of or more involved in, committed to doing something about income equality, does that overflow into some level of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, something like that? I had not really thought about it. So that's a very embryonic translation of that into the kind of thing that I do. But I think that is a killer point, actually.
I would only make one other
Jessica.
point. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Jessica and Mommy, I know Jessica from Twitter, but we've never met before. So hi, Jessica.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. I wanted to ask if you will have any social scientists or humanities scientists work with you, because if we're going to develop a framework to combat anti-Semitism, for just as a small example, the quote that you pulled about whiteness, we need to know who said that and in what context. How are they defining whiteness? And that goes to the heart of what what professors who are social scientists who are going crazy in the academy, like me, are trying to combat. So in our case, my belief is that there is a sort of a topsy-turvy definition of power, in the sense that Jews are seen as all powerful. And I always try to combat that by showing Jewish history and showing Will Eisner's book about protocols. So, so my question is, will you deepen the theory in your findings, which are fascinating, by running it by social scientists that are more into these studies of critical race theory?
Thank you. So Lee, please respond, and then Peter has his hand up for a long time. He'll be next.
Well, yeah, I mean, most of these studies are already with a team of social scientists. We do eventually plan to publish this stuff in conventional academic peer-reviewed journals. Probably going to be an uphill battle, but I fight uphill battles all the time, so I'm not really worried about that. And so in that sense, it'll be vetted by other social scientists. Now, on the narrow issue of critical race theory, I basically think it's a lot of political axe grinding wrapped around a few nuggets of truth. So, that's my general take. And I probably won't be seeking out most critical race theorists to vet any of this. In fact, most of what I do is empirical. That is, we conduct surveys, we do online media analysis, and that kind of analysis is routinely now denounced as white science. I mean, because there's no such thing as science. There's just power moves, and science is just a masquerade for white supremacy. There's no such thing as objectivity or neutrality. So it's all just positionality and power moves. So I probably won't be seeking out many critical race theorists to vet this work. That doesn't mean, as Charles pointed out, as bad as, my opinion is that most of those ideas are really, really bad, but they're not all really, really bad. There is some truth in some of those ideas, and it is worth extracting those truths and informing one's own work based on those. So that's my
Charles, could I just chime in here for a second?
No, hang on. Peter's had his hand up for a long time, and then Bill. Peter?
Oh, thank you. First of all, I want to thank ISGAP and Dr. Small. I've watched you now for a few weeks. Very interesting what Lee Jussim is saying. And I like Professor Mattathias because he was showing something that I was, a submarine or an airplane in the background. I'm a Holocaust survivor, and I'm a Jew, or better, Jewish person. I was born in the Netherlands, and I lived in 4 different countries in 3 different and under 3 different dictatorships. I've become a lecturer in my retirement. And I'm part, and I grew up, and I'm part of Anne Frank USA, because I grew up with Anne, and the Franks and us were very good friends. What I have been hearing from all of you is fascinating. A lot of it theoretical. How do we, in German Jewish, Tachlis, the bottom line, implement and do what some of you are advocating? And we don't have much time. I'm 86 and a half. We are now engaged, Professor Matthias just mentioned something, in a new, which we call, it's a dream that it's just been, as we say in German, engagiert, traveling education program in Bavaria. Actually, it's in Germany, with the support of the German Bavarian Education Department, various other organizations, and Anne Frank Zentrum in Berlin. To quote the Department of Education of Bavaria, to rekindle 1700 years of Jewish life in Germany. So the importance of why and how and where and whatever that you're all elucidating on is extremely important. But we have to educate and set up the curriculums to combat ignorance with knowledge and make sure that taking what some of you are talking about is taken as a possible norm. But what and how and where anti-Semitism has started, that goes back 5,000 years. Are we rekindling all of that? Are we reinventing a wheel on what is or was and how anti-Semitism? In view of the phenomenal ignorance, some by people who really do not know, which is growing in America, not to talk about other areas, but sadly, by those in governments like in ours in America, who know the story of anti-Semitism and deny it. So there are movements in America happening now. I wish ISGAP will make contact with our number 2 man in our government, who has been traveling in Europe with Mrs. IST and others, advocating how to combat anti-Semitism. That's Doug Emhoff. And I think if you could consider combining your education with what is practically trying to happen in America, and Germany is supporting this in spite of all the other problems, not to talk about Argentina, where I grew up and lived 20 years, which was one of the dictatorships under Perón. Well, here we are. Give us the tools. Tell us, so that some of the things that are happening in our colleges, in lack of education or whatever, and through Anne Frank, we just developed and facilitated the teaching by law in all public schools 5-12, and believe it or not, a red Republican state in the South, Arkansas, from all states. I never thought that would be possible. It happened. So things are happening on both sides. So I think I made my point. I think that if you come up with some suggestions to us of how to implement and do, then I think academia will be well put to educate our students and combat ignorance with knowledge. Because as you all know much better than I, much of all these philosophies started in universities in Europe years ago.
Peter,
So-
thank you, Peter.
I end my little dissertation. Is one thing I like to ask.
Before you ask your question,
One thing.
Peter, before you ask your question, please be
Yes, Daniel Pelli. If anybody knows if Daniel Pelli's relatives were in Switzerland in the late 50s, early 60s, I want to know that, because I worked at the Swiss Bank Corporation in Zurich with a fellow called Pelli. Thank you.
Thank you. So, and Peter, please be in touch with Daphne and we could discuss the Anne Frank House and the work that you're doing and the work that ISGAP is doing on curriculum development.
Where are you located, Dr. Small?
Mostly in the United States.
You're now talking from the United States?
Yeah.
Where, in what city?
Miami.
Excuse me?
I'm in Miami now.
Ah, I'm 3 hours away from you. Sarasota County.
All right, not so far.
Come and visit. Let's get together.
Okay, thank you. I'd be happy to meet with you. I'd be honored.
Anytime. I'll be delighted.
Thank you. Thank you. And I see Daniel's here, Mr. Pelli. Do you want to respond? Do you have any Swiss family? We're playing Jewish geography in the middle of the seminar.
No, that I don't have a connection to anyone in Switzerland, but thanks for asking, Peter. And I'm not far from you, also in Florida, and I'd hope to see you, Peter.
Where are you?
I'm in Winter Park.
And where?
Winter Park, but let's move on.
Okay.
Yeah,
I
just
have a quick question, if I may,
go
for
for
Lee.
it, Daniel.
So
Daniel,
Lee, I was excited to hear that some psychologists were going to get involved in this discussion. And going on Peter's point, which is how do we go about, is there a psychological way in a very practical, applied manner where we can counter factual inaccuracies and ignorance? And is that something that you can work on and that we can include in this conceptual framework? I'm sure many of us have a lot of examples when we debate those on the other side, and we end up pulling our hair because we have to debate basic facts. And maybe that should be, in my view, part of this framework that Charles and Bill and others are trying to come up with, is how do you go about establishing basic facts so you can move on from there?
Well, I have a quick suggestion for you professors, which I didn't know. I'm not an academician. I'm just a lecturer, but I came from the business world. I learned not too long ago that universities, a few, I don't know if all, in America, who have various campuses, don't communicate with their own campuses. And each time I mention something, they smile because naturally there's some politics internally at the universities. Well, how fine would it be if they start to uniting and working together on lectures and programs in their own universities? It's just one thing. The other thing is, as you all know, we Jewish people, I don't like to call us Jews because it has a connotation in my head, but we are sometimes our worst and our best friends and enemies. How about if we get all or some of the conservative Jewish groups together? I'm not, I'm liberal, reform, and get together and work on some education things where we can have same and meet and agree on what we can agree. We haven't done that yet. So if we have certain conservative organizations, they go into their thing and we do our thing. So where is the unity?
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Christine, your hand has been up for a long time.
Yes. Hi, everyone. You know, the thing that I wanted to just address specifically is you talk as a, you know, the practical ways, what can be done, you know, in a practical way. And in a sense, it comes down to what one can have influence over in one's own locale, and the influence that one has oneself, because everything that is going on is so overwhelming that for me, and I speak personally, I really try always to see what I can do in my own local sphere, right? And what I mean by that is it's standing up. It's when you see anything, whether it's, you know, just a name calling. I mean, all these small acts add up. And that is something that I think people can be very open to, because it gives them an understanding that they can make a difference. And so that's what I'm trying to do in a new course, online course for lifelong learners that I'm in process of developing under ISGAP. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. So I think we're a bit 5 minutes over time. I'll give the last word or last comment or question to Carrie, and then we can wrap it up.
Yeah, I just have, I guess, what is a quick challenge or a moment of the acceptance of our fated condition. So my question would be, in moving forward, should we accept that we cannot produce a unified theory that explains the rise of contemporary anti-Semitism?
Good question.
No one has one so far, and I don't really see one on the horizon. In effect, we have to work with the components and the social settings in which different influences dominate, but we're not going to get to a silver bullet that gives us a unified explanation. What do you think?
I agree with that. I'm just going to end there because I think that's exactly right.
And I respectfully disagree. And even if I'm wrong, it gives us something to do for a while.
That's absolutely true. It gives us something to do.
Who knew that this was an adversarial collaboration, Charles? I had no idea.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think it's possible, because I think if you look at other issues like racism and sexism and homophobia, it is possible to have a framework of analysis that could help.
Well, I think, you know, Professor Small, I'd just like to interject something to go a little bit into a political situation. If we watched some of the faces and some of the things that our government people have said in the last 2 months, including President Biden's speech last week, I think the easier thing for some of these people is to accuse the Jews.
Sure.
That we are there.
A framework.
So what is the answer? Gary, I take what you're
theory.
saying, and I respect you. I think you had a good point. But one of the person, I'm not going to mention the name, she knows better. So how do we handle this? Now, if we go into the campuses, which is what most of you are involved with, and we as parents and grandparents, there we have Soros.
Yeah.
And this is important, what you're teaching, but then to go into more practical things. And you all have, and I have also lectured at Hillel's and other campus of universities. but it's amazing, you know, with students, I can understand that they may not all be aware or knowledgeable. But when we get to middle-aged and adults, well, then that's another story.
Okay, thank you. Bill, are you still here? Bill's gone. Okay, Lee, on behalf of everybody, thank you very much. And thank you for putting up with the impromptu jazz moment. I appreciate it.
I hope it works.
You're
Thanks for
yeah,
having
that was
me.
great. You have a lot of insights.
Dr. Smile, call us. Mr.
Okay.
Pelly, you too. I
Thank-
knew a Pelly long ago. He was a wonderful man in Zurich at the Swiss Bank Corporation.
Everybody have a good rest of your week and stay well and safe.
Thank you. You
Lee,
too.
thank you so much. Thank
Are we
you.
staying on, you and I, or we don't need
Thank
to?
you
Can I
for
call you
setting
in
it all
10
up.
I'll call you in 10 minutes, Lee.
Okay, all right,
Okay, cool.
okay.
Thank you. Thank you.